None of what we're seeing is possible without some division, specifically division into groups.
Welcome to the Manipulation Check with Dr. Jeff Spence and Dr. Dan Smilek. They are just two academics with PhDs in psychology trying to make sense of the world. Come and listen to the conversation.
How are you doing, Jeff?
I'm doing well, Dan. How are you?
Doing all right. Well, let's jump right into it with just a quick recap. In the last episode, we focused on the implementation of the vaccine mandates. And we talked about how people are suffering because some of them lost their jobs. Others have been suspended. We had people de-enrolled from universities. People can't travel. They can't go to restaurants. And all this is as a result of other people implementing these vaccine mandates. And of course, the government and public health creating these vaccine mandates. And we asked the critical question, are there principles of psychology that can explain this situation and maybe even point to solutions? Because we're just a couple of Canadian guys who want to be friends with everyone. But there are these wedges that are being driven between people. And we find that very concerning. We want to find some solutions. So Jeff, what's our plan for this episode?
So what we're going to do today, we're going to do a quick recap of Milgram because there's some good ideas in there. We just want to highlight some key points. Then we're going to get into what's called, or what I'll be calling anyways, in-group, out-group processes.
Okay.
And that's some stuff that we touched on a little bit last episode. We kind of peppered a little bit in, but we want to get a little bit more into that, a bit more in depth, because I think it's some really foundational stuff that's sort of a precursor for all of what we're seeing. So rough hypothesis, if we're allowed to have hypotheses, can we have hypotheses on podcasts?
We can certainly have some hypotheses, yeah, because we're scientists.
So we can have some hypotheses. So one hypothesis is, or let's say, I'll stick with the hypothesis, is that none of what we're seeing is possible without some division, specifically division into groups.
Yes.
And that's what we're going to get into today. So do you know who we love, Dan?
Who do we love?
We love us.
That's right. As opposed to them.
Who do we hate?
We hate them.
We hate them. Yeah. And everybody feels that way.
That's right.
About us and them. So we're going to talk about us and them.
Okay. So in terms of a quick review of Milgram, our viewers and listeners might recall that Milgram discussed the dynamics that unfolded in what he called an authority system that consisted of an authority, an executant. Did I say that right? Not executant. I was playing on words and then I just kept using that.
This is the question, right? So what is the proper pronunciation?
And the proper meaning.
Is it eggs? And is it eggs? So where's the emphasis, right?
Yeah.
So is it
executant?
Executant, yeah, or executant.
I use executant just because I like how it's related to, execute.
It's got a bit of a,
it's
got a bit more of a applicable maybe.
Yeah, but we should try to get this right so that it doesn't get built into my vocabulary the wrong way. Executant and a victim. So we had the authority, the executant, and the victim. And Milgram brought people into the lab under the auspice of a learning experiment. And he had these participants essentially play the role of a teacher in which they had to apply increasingly stronger shocks to a learner. And you recall, Jeff, that in the initial experiment, 65% of the participants applied the maximum 450 volt shock that said like extremely dangerous XXX, even though the learner was in massive distress. So the learner's like, and then he even stops responding and they keep applying the shock. So in the experimenter teacher learner paradigm, I think what Milgram did is he created a conflict between the subject's everyday value of not hurting somebody else, not inflicting pain on somebody else, and their value of obeying authority. And he wanted to see how that played out. And what he found is under these conditions, there is this inflation of the authority, what he called a counter anthropomorphism. There's a devaluation of the victim. There is this agentic shift where you shift the responsibility for your actions onto the authority, and you just feel like you can now do whatever the authority tells you. And then there's also this idea that you allow the authority to interpret your actions, including the morality of your actions. So I refer to that as the interpretive shift. That's our term, not Milgram's term, but that's what unfolds. And what he found is that, as the cover of Milgram's book says, and I have the cover right here, relatively few people, it says, have the resources needed to resist authority. So people on the great large number of the people will obey right to the end. And as a way of transitioning into your discussion of in-group, out-group dynamics, and as a way of applying Milgram to the vaccine mandate situation, I have a couple clips from Global News, a Global News report, and it's of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He's on the campaign trail back in August 2021. And I want you to listen carefully to the rhetoric, and then we can talk about it.
So the folks out there tonight shouting, the anti-vaxxers, they're wrong. They're wrong about how we get through this pandemic. And more than just being wrong, because everyone's entitled to their opinions, they are putting at risk their own kids, and they're putting at risk our kids as well. That's why we've been unequivocal. If you want to get on a plane or a train in the coming months, you're going to have to be fully vaccinated. So families with their kids don't have to worry that someone is going to put them in danger in the seat next to them or across the aisle. And we know that the way to get through this as well is to make sure that people can go into non-essential businesses and feel safe that they're not going to catch COVID from someone next to them. And that means we're going to work with provinces and territories who want to move forward on vaccination certifications, on vaccination passports, so that everyone can be safe. And what's more, the federal government has announced we're going to pay for the development of those privileges that you get once you get vaccinated, because everyone needs to get vaccinated. Woo! Those people are putting us all at risk.
Right, we're going to get our privileges back if we obey. So Trudeau here would be the authority, and he also articulates the overarching framework or the overarching ideology. And the basic idea is that the anti-vaxxers, they got it wrong. They're not taking the vaccine, and that's putting other people at risk. And thus vaccine mandates
I'll jump in there.
Yeah.
It's they are putting us at risk.
That's right.
Just as a bit of a preview for where we're going. But yeah, it's them and then it's us. It's them and it's we.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and you have to take these vaccines, and there has to be a mandate, and because it's critical for our survival and the survival of your children and the return to normal life. And then he also has the command, right? So the authority here is effectively, not precisely, but issuing a command. You need the mandates, you need the passports. And of course, now Trudeau has been reelected, and we see how those things have been implemented. Now he goes on in this.
Canadians made incredible sacrifices over the past year and a half, and Aaron O'Toole is siding with them instead of with Canadians who did their part and stepped up. He's talking about personal choice. What about my choice to keep my kids safe? What about our choices to make sure we're getting through this pandemic as quickly as we can? That's the choice we've all made. Canadians have shown it in being there for each other. And I am not going to back down, no matter how many of them show up to try and shout us down from what I know to be true, what science tells us, what Canadians have told me, which is people are willing to do their part to get through this pandemic, and that's what we will do together. So shame on you, Aaron O'Toole. You need to condemn those people. You need to correct them. You need to use your voice and actually add it to those of us who understand that vaccinations are the way through this pandemic, and listen to the almost 80% of Canadians who know that too.
It's, to be honest, a little chilling to listen to that. But you notice that Trudeau references science and all Canadians, so he's essentially deriving his authority from those things. He, again, for the overarching ideology, he references science, and then he issues more directives, essentially. We need to condemn those anti-vaxxers. You need to correct them.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, you know, implementing the mandates and the passports. So there you have it, a real live application of the principles that we've been talking about. And then, of course, there are people who are the executants who will go out now and implement all of these things because they've been commanded by the authority to do so. And that's why we're seeing all this, what we would call division and suffering in our midst. And Jeff, you highlighted something interesting there. Already, you see other principles at play, including this idea of in-group and out-group dynamics.
Yeah. So we're clearly in that rhetoric. We're seeing the them, you know, we're seeing the us, we're seeing the we, and even in referencing Canadians, it's kind of in there, but it's sort of like the Canadians are telling me this, and they're not part of that group. So these anti-vaxxers, as he's calling them, that they don't get the Canadian label. So you'll notice the Canadian label gets applied to the people who are supportive of doing the vaccine mandates.
That is a great insight.
They never get the privilege. It's not Canadians who think one way and Canadians who think another way. It's Canadians have told me this. They want this 80%. But then before that, he says, well, I don't care about how many people of them there are. I'm still going to do this. But then they don't want me to do it. They don't want the mandates. They don't want the vaccines, but they're not ever referenced as Canadians.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, in a recent speech also in French, he was a little bit more fiery. I have the transcript and he says, but there are also, and this is a translation, so I don't know how perfectly accurate it is, but so somebody should fact check this. But so he says, but there are also people who are fiercely against vaccination. They are extremists who don't believe in science. They're often misogynists, also often racists. It's a small group that muscles in, and we have to make a choice in terms of leaders, in terms of our country. Do we tolerate these people, right? So it really exemplifies what you're talking about. There's this other group, them bad, we good.
Yeah, real wedge, as you said, real division.
So maybe you just jump right in there and start talking about this in-group, out-group dynamic, the intergroup dynamics that you've learned about.
Yeah, so intergroup, that's often a label used in the literature. Intergroup basically just means between groups. So how do groups act towards each other? You know, but as we've talked about, what we're seeing, you may have heard the phrase, or you may have heard about how we've been polarized, and how there's no middle anymore. And the reason for that, I would say, is not because we're actually polarized. Maybe we are now a bit more than we ever have been, but I think we've been dichotomized. We've been classified, and I'm going to introduce a new term here, another new term on the Manipulation Check podcast.
Woo.
I don't know if we have do we have a sound effect for new terms?
No.
I don't know if we do. We don't. Okay.
I can see.
So the new term we have, that I'm calling it anyways, is manufactured polarization.
Okay, hold on one second here. Hold on one second.
Do we have a sound effect? Manufactured polarization.
There we go.
It is.
Okay, and what do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that is we're not actually polarized. We've been artificially polarized, so to speak, vis-a-vis dichotomization. So this is something that actually happens quite often in psychology, and it's rarely a good idea to do. But I'll give you an example. So let's say we have a bunch of people who are different ages, and say ranging from toddlers, let's say 2 years old to 95 years old. And there's a bunch of people with varying ages within that range. And then a researcher comes along and says, you know what? I don't care about all those different age numbers. I'm interested in old people and young people. So the researcher comes along and does something we sometimes call the median split, let's say. So you go in the middle and you say, okay, if you're above this value, you're old. And if you're below this value, you're young. Mm-hmm. So that would be dichotomizing what would otherwise be the more technical term, a continuous variable. So there's varying degrees of differences, all kinds of minor distinctions. And what you do is you come along with a really crude chop and say, okay, everybody in above this point is now this label, and everybody below this point is now this other label. So the reason, one of the key reasons it's rarely a good idea to do is because of the specific effect it has on people who are most similar to each other. Right. So if you take a toddler and you take a 95-year-old, they're different. They're young, they're old. But when you start getting in closer to the middle range, 25-year-old versus a 35-year-old, 40-year-old versus a 50-year-old, now you're seeing some distinctions there. And what you're doing with the dichotomization is you're making certain people who are actually quite similar, all of a sudden now they're very different.
Right. Yeah. So you're separating the middle and making it, you're treating it as if though they were a bit more different from each other, maybe a bit more closer to the extremes. And maybe also what you're doing is you're taking some of the extremes and just pulling it in. So you just have two categories. You have two instances of a categorization essentially. Yeah.
So any kind of nuance or distinction immediately gets wiped out, gets obliterated. And now you could, let's say you did a split around 35 years old, 35 below young, 35 above old. Now all of a sudden you're saying a 34-year-old, for example, is young just like a toddler is young.
Yeah.
And now you're saying a 40-year-old is old just like a 95-year-old is old. And now a toddler and a 95-year-old are just as different as a 30-year-old and a 40-year-old. They're both one, some of them are young, some of them are old, and that's as far as it goes. So that would be, so go ahead.
Yeah. So in this concept of the intergroup dynamics, what's happening is you get these artificial groups being constructed, and then all the individual differences within the groups are essentially obscured, and you're just treating people on this binary category, in terms of this binary category structure. You're either this or you're that. So you're either us or them.
Exactly. So think about all the range of opinion people can have on all matter of things related to COVID, related to the vaccine, related to pandemic response, related to mandates, related to passports. All matter of opinions get boiled down to pro or anti.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And
so go ahead.
Yeah. And so what happens then as a result of that? So once you've categorized somebody into these artificial categories, are there things that automatically start occurring, or can it just stay neutral like that? And can you just have a couple categories? Like, what's wrong with having some categories here, Jeff?
What's a great question. What's wrong with having some categories? And one of the things we do as people, we use categories to simplify our environment.
Yes.
So they can have some very clear advantage. So putting people into groups, into categories is something that's very natural. It can be very efficient to do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So
what we have here is a situation where we have categories that have been created relatively recently. And so another thing to keep in mind too is there's all kinds of ways that we can categorize people, but not all of them get used. So for example, let's say for years I've been trying to get a categorization going of left-handed people versus everybody else.
Okay.
It's not working out too well.
No.
So some people are left-handed, so I'm left-handed. Some people are left-handed, some people are right-handed. I want to get a left-handed us versus them thing going with lefties and righties.
I have two left-handed daughters, so they might join you.
See, they haven't been at any of the meetings.
Yes.
So there's all kinds of ways we can classify. And so what's interesting about this is the reason for the classification and how much of an effect it's had and how much traction it's gotten. Do you see the distinction?
Yeah, that effectively, it's something that didn't exist before. It's a category that was just created. Before this, there weren't really COVID vaxxed or double vaxxed or unvaxxed or anti. There were some people who were anti-vaccine, but that didn't really matter so much. But now these categories have been really created and brought to the forefront, and they seem to be distinguishing people, and they've created these fissures in our culture. Exactly.
So it's the categories can be completely created. So groups can be created, so to speak, out of thin air.
Yeah. Okay. And so what's the consequence then? So
one of the questions, so if we get back to our initial question of, we're seeing all this discrimination, we're seeing all these, all these policies negatively affecting people. Can the simple separation of people into these groups, let's say the us and the them, can this be responsible, contribute to some of the discrimination we're seeing?
Right. So you're saying that just by this idea of forming or identifying or creating groups, does that somehow automatically lead to discrimination?
Yeah. So one of the things that's tricky about studying groups or asking these kinds of questions is groups come with all kinds of baggage. So let's say existing groups, whether they be political groups, linguistic groups, religious groups, ethnic groups, what have you, they all come with history, with norms of how they treat each other, how they treat other people. And it's really hard to disentangle the effect of some of those, let's say, confounds or some of those other variables in terms of how groups treat each other. So do groups treat each other because there's this history of conflict, or do groups treat each other differently because of there's certain norms that are learned? And you really can't disentangle. It's really difficult to disentangle, what is it about groups that may be responsible for them treating each other differently or treating each other poorly or discriminating against each other. So to really drill down to the question of, okay, is there something about quite simply the separation and categorization of people into groups that could be responsible to this? We can look to some classic social psychology research. This stuff happened in the early 70s, so it came after Milgram. And this was research specifically asking the question of, is there something about this categorization itself that is responsible for some discrimination we're seeing across groups? So it was research done by Henry Tajfel. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but that's the pronunciation I'm going to go with. So it's Henry with an I, Tajfel, Tajfel, I believe.
Yep.
And he did some really interesting research. So basically what he found was he created these groups. He brought people into a lab and he created these groups that were basically meaningless. And he got them to engage in these resource allocation tasks.
So
what he found.
So did he just
go ahead.
Did he just ask people? How did he categorize them? Did he just say, "You guys belong to one group and you guys belong to this other group," based on what? Any criteria or?
Right. So great question. So what he ended up doing was, so I'll give the spoiler first. So what he basically found was the simple classification of people into groups can lead to discrimination. That's the lead. Let's say that's the spoiler. So people favor their in-group, punish their out-group without anything else about groups involved in the picture. So no norms, no history, no conflict, no competition, no self-interest. That's the general finding.
I just want to say, hey, to our listeners, think about that for a second. Okay, you just very simply brought people in, put them into two groups, and then all of a sudden you get discrimination of the people in the out-group. Like that is so profound. That is so powerful and profound. Yeah. And
it's even more interesting that because the way he did it. So what he did was he was 1971. There's a publication, 3 studies. They basically all found the same thing using slightly different methodology. But what he did was he got people to come in and do some kind of just a pointless task, for example. So one of the tasks was getting people to look at dots on a screen and estimate how many dots there were. Say, okay,
Simple.
just do this task. It's very simple. Another one, you get people to come in and they look at paintings, these abstract paintings, and they say, okay, which ones do you like better? Or which one, like, give your rating on how much you like these. And then what he did was, okay, since you're here, we got another task for you to do, but this task involves people being put into groups. So he said, okay, based on your responses to the dots, how many dots you guessed there were, you're a overestimator. And some people are underestimators. You're an overestimator, so you're going to be in the overestimator group. Another classification he had was accuracy. So, you're an accurate guesser, estimator, and then you're less than accurate. So one of the things that was interesting about that distinction there is, so you get an overestimator, underestimator versus an accurate estimator or a less than accurate estimator, is that presumably accuracy is more valuable than just being over or under.
Yeah, because over and under has no real bearing on accuracy, right? It's completely independent from accuracy. It just means that you're equally, you could be as equally wrong as somebody else, but in one case you're overestimating the number and the other person is equally as wrong but underestimating the number. So it's separate from accuracy. Yeah.
So one of the ideas he had was maybe the value associated with the group. So some groups are more valuable. They're formed for more, let's say, benevolent reasons, if that's going to have an impact on how people react in these groups. So groups formed for kind of meaningless reasons versus groups formed under some kind of meaning.
Right.
So that was one of the let's say conditions he had in the study. And what he found was basically no difference. The value of the groups had no difference.
So
on how people responded.
So even if you're being categorized based not at all on performance, it's just some kind of less,
something nobody cares about.
Yeah, less relevant or almost irrelevant aspect of your performance, you still treat your in-group members more preferably than you treat the out-group members.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even on these, and just Jeff, very quickly, because he uses a word, and I'm looking at is it the Scientific American paper? That one of the ones?
Well, yeah. So there's two papers.
Yeah.
Well, I'll call it one paper, and then one was a magazine article that summarized the paper.
Okay. Right.
So there's a peer-reviewed publication, 1971. Interestingly, 1970, so the year before, there was a summary article that basically walked through, okay, here's what all this means.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at that summary article here, and he uses the categorization criteria for in-group and out-group. He uses the word flimsy criteria, that these were just such flimsy criteria. So let me just read the section. Yet neither an objective conflict of interest nor hostility had any relevance whatever to what our subjects were asked to do. It was enough for them to see themselves as clearly categorized into an in-group and an out-group, flimsy as the criteria for this division were. Mm-hmm. Even though the boys, and he was actually studying boys, I guess, knew one another well before the experiment, their own individual gains were not involved in their decisions because their judgments didn't affect their own gains, and their actions could have been aimed to achieve the greatest common good. So even despite all those conditions that you'd think would maximize actually maybe cooperation or benefiting the other group as well, no, you get, or maybe not even treating them as different at all. But no, in those cases, you get this association with an in-group, and you treat the out-group more negatively. Wow. Flimsy. Division.
So it's flimsy, and it's even flimsier than that. It's even flimsier than it appears, because check this out. One of the things he did with the grouping was all done privately. So what ended up happening was students came in. Another interesting aspect he pointed out was all the participants at any given time knew each other. So they all came from the same class, the same school, which is interesting to think about. So they're ultimately discriminating against people they know before. So we can talk about that a bit later. So the classification was actually done privately. So groups were brought into the lab. They did this task, and then they were categorized. But the categorization wasn't done in any sort of, like I said, it was done privately. So there was no opportunities for the experimenter to go around and say, okay, you're this group, you're that group, you're this group, you're that group. And then, okay, group huddle, now everybody go and do their tasks. There was no public classification. So they didn't see, there was no opportunity for even the slightest bit of cohesion or recognition as to who was in which group. Does that make sense?
Yep, totally. Yeah.
So they got brought out of the lab, sat down in a cubicle. They were told what their group was, and then they were given basically sheets of paper that said, okay, now decide who's going to get what. This person's in this group. This other person's in this group. Remember, you're in this other group.
And
so very, very stripped down.
Yeah. And in their judgments, in the judgments that they made, basically they were asked in some circumstances to allocate money to either a member of the outgroup, of the other group, or their own group. And sometimes that meant that those two things were in conflict, right? So if you were to give more money to your in-group, you would also then give less money to the out-group. In other cases, they were asked to allocate money just to members of the out-group, and then in other cases still allocate money just to members of their in-group, right? Mm-hmm. So they're just...
So they were allocating actual money.
Okay.
So it wasn't an evaluation, it wasn't pretend, it was points that ultimately resulted in a dollar value, or back then I think it was pennies value that people were going to leave the lab with. So this is what people they know, their classmates were going to get this amount of money based on how they were classifying, how they were allocating the rewards.
Right. And they're doing this as a paper and pencil kind of test, right? So they open up a booklet, and then it says, okay, here are some matrices of
you said the word,
the crazy matrices where you get to give so much money to a person in the other group and so much money to a person in your own group, let's say in some cases, and they would circle how much money and so on. And so what were the consistent findings there? Can you just summarize those?
Right. So before I do that, another thing I want to highlight is the allocation of resources.
Yeah.
It wasn't based on anything. There was no task, there was no pretext, there's no context. It was like you said, here's a booklet, fill it, like respond. Rewards, punishments. How much money do you want this person to get? How much money would you want that person to get? And by this person and that person, it was anonymous as well. So they're just numbers. So they didn't have names or anything. So they didn't know who they were going to be allocating the rewards or punishments to. It was just, okay, this person's in your group, this person's not in your group. So really, there is no context again. Like, so this is brilliant in some sense, because you're decontextualizing it, right? And then you're seeing everything about a group that you can recognize as being part of a group, just strip it right out.
Right. You don't even see the other person at that point. It's just, you're just referred to as the other and your group and the other group, us versus them. That's it. And the whole situation is set up that way. Okay. And then, so in that scenario, what do you find?
Yeah. So the classification is completely in the participant's mind.
Yeah.
Completely in their mind. There's no basis for it, right?
Yeah.
Other than what they've been told. They've been told there's these two groups.
Yeah.
Remember that, meanings criteria. So here's what they find. Or here's what they found. The specific numbers, let's say study 1, 80, got the number right here. Should remember, 84% showed favoritism in study 1, favoritism to their in-group. And favoritism to their in-group in this particular study meant punishing the out-group. So if you favor your in-group, it automatically means you're going to be punishing the out-group. And by punishing the out-group, what you're doing is you're taking money away from them. So you're giving money to your in-group, at the same time you're taking money away from the out-group.
Right.
Another study found roughly the same paradigm, slightly different, using the classification of paintings, slightly different manipulations, but overall, generally speaking, it was roughly 72% demonstrated favoritism towards their in-group over the out-group under these conditions.
Wow.
Another thing to highlight, I think you mentioned it already, there's no personal incentive for the participants. So the participants didn't get anything out of allocating rewards to the in-group. So the allocation of rewards wasn't a group allocation. It was an individual allocation of somebody who just happened to be in the same group as the participant. Mm-hmm. So the participant got no benefit. There wasn't any incentive with respect to money or even indirect benefits that participant would have received.
Yeah. So the other really brilliant thing to point out here about this experiment is that it's not looking at just people's subjective reports, let's say, of their attitudes towards the other group. It's looking at behavior discriminatory behavior. So you're actually, this is real money that they're playing with here, and you're actually measuring discriminatory behavior. And there's an interesting question we can get to, which is, to what extent were these youths aware that they were discriminating? But it's the behavior, right? So this is very kind of concrete almost. We don't have to sort of think about what their judgments were and whether they were skewed, their subjective reports or whatnot. We're talking about behavior. Fascinating.
Yeah, and I'll emphasize again too, they were doing it to people they knew, and they knew they were doing it to people they knew.
Yeah.
So they had pre-existing relationships with these people, and then a group classification comes along, and now all of a sudden this completely irrelevant, made-up classification is dictating how they're going to behave to people they know. Rewarding and punishing.
This is okay. I gotta bring the relevance here right away, if you don't mind, to
right,
the current situation, because the whole point that you're trying to make here, right, is that the vaccine mandates essentially created this sort of in-group, out-group dynamic that wasn't there before, and now your categorization into those groups can override. It can override your previous relationships with other people, right?
See, I would change something slightly in that. I think my thought is the division comes before the mandates.
Okay.
So the mandates don't create the division. The division gets created, promoted, identified. That opens the door for the mandates, the punishing, the rewarding.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
That makes sense?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's a really
necessary
important point.
Necessary precondition for
and so
for the mandates.
So one way to think about these two groups would be in terms of people who are vaccinated and people who are unvaccinated. And there was this whole idea of even calling people double vax, although that's kind of now getting stale because things are changing. Right. But there was like the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. But the other way to think about it, really, because again, people are trying to simplify things, right? So the simplifications you need a binary choice, two different alternatives. But really, you also have these people who have been vaccinated and who don't support the vaccine mandates and who won't show their passes, are against the whole thing. And so that's interesting, because the other way you can think about it is really a splitting between those who support vaccine mandates, those who are for coercive vaccine, and those who are for freedom of choice, right? Those who are not for coercive vaccination. So which one of those categorizations do you think is the one that we should be concerned about? Both, maybe?
Yeah, it's hard to... Yeah, I don't know if I could make a call on that.
So, okay, so
here's I'll answer that question. I'll give a different option. I think categorizing in any way, shape, or form is concerning, given what we know with this research.
Yeah.
So I think beware of these classifications, beware of these categorizations, because what they ultimately end up doing is creating division by definition. But then with that division, what we get, if we just base it on this, like I said, foundational research, social psychology, we're going to get discriminatory behavior. So I'll read a quote from Tajfel. I believe this was from the Scientific American article where he summarized it. Can discrimination be traced to some such origin as social conflict or a history of hostility? Not necessarily. Apparently, the mere fact of division into groups is enough to trigger discriminatory behavior.
Right.
So if you want to create discrimination, create division. You can reverse engineer it, right? Both ways. So if division creates discrimination, if you want to create discrimination, create division. If you want to eliminate discrimination, maybe what you need to do is reduce division. Right.
So in some sense, it doesn't matter which way you cut the pizza in half. But I think that there might be this interest, like the rhetoric that I hear, it's about vax, anti-vax. And what that probably does is try to group a whole lot of people who are vaccinated, but are against the mandates into the we. They're trying to pull them into the we so that they would feel like they're in opposition to those who are not vaccinated. And maybe that's part of this whole dynamic that's unfolding, right? It's the division, trying to basically take the other and then divide them and then pull some of them into get them to associate with the us, right? So that they will also then maybe have negative views towards the remaining other.
Yeah. Yeah. So we can get into, if you want to get into, we can get into maybe some solutions or some strategies. That could be one of managing the landscape of division, and maybe like, you know, using your opponent's energy against them, so to speak, and leveraging some of these dynamics to leveraging the divisions to create less division. Yes, I guess is that fair? What you're suggesting?
Yeah, or and I think it works both ways. Like there are people trying to, depending on who's the us, right? I think this dynamic is already at play to some extent. But just before we get off to the solutions and so on, let me just draw attention to one other point that I found really interesting in Tajfel. He has this concept of gratuitous discrimination.
Yes.
So even when it's not like it's just the fact that you're trying to benefit your own group, even when your choice has no bearing on your own group, you are punishing the other group or discriminating negatively against the out group. Mm-hmm. It's mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah. And once again, very stripped down. No context, no norms, like no emotion really.
Yeah, that's right. And so
like there would be no team spirit, so to speak, of the in-group.
Yeah.
You don't even know who's in the group. You just know there's this vague idea, this semblance that there is in fact some group out there.
Flimsy group membership.
Flimsy, yep.
And
an overstatement, arguably. Flimsy is a generous term.
Yeah, and we could relate this to other literature in other fields, mm-hmm. including sociology, which explore the dynamics among ethno-cultural groups of different sorts and the discrimination of minorities. And that's a bit different again, because there the people have long histories, right? Mm-hmm. Long histories, maybe even genetic cultural affiliations, which are enduring and maybe difficult to change. This is very different. This mm-hmm. is like you just created the categorization out of thin air effectively. Yeah. But the concept that they use in some of this other literature looking at these various ethno-cultural group dynamics is the term othering. That's the concept. And I have a quote here from a paper by Johnson and colleagues, and they're talking about this in the healthcare context. And let me see if I can find the quote here. They're talking about marginalization of people in the healthcare system. And here's what they write. One form of this marginalization has been referred to as othering. Othering not only serves to mark and name those thought to be different from oneself, but also is a process through which people construct their own identities in reference to others. By talking about individuals or groups as other, one magnifies and enforces projections of apparent difference from oneself. Othering practices can, albeit sometimes unintentionally, serve to reinforce and reproduce positions of domination and subordination. Consequently, persons who are treated as other often experience marginalization, decreased opportunities, and exclusion, end quote. And so this is what's going on, and this is in the context of ethno-cultural groups, but I think the ideas relate to this whole discussion of the pro-vaccine mandate and, pro-freedom kind of division, because again, those people who are pro-freedom, who are maybe not vaccinated or against coercive vaccination, they are now being marginalized. They're the other in society.
Mm-hmm. They're the them.
They're the them. That's right. And so that's the concept in a slightly different field from social psychology. But I think these ideas are pretty related to each other.
Yeah, it's somewhat similar to a concept that's called infrahumanization. And it's something we talked about a little bit the last episode, but it's a very interesting phenomenon that's a consequence of this in-group, out-group. So when you have these groups, you have the us, you have the them. One of the things that could happen, and this is somewhat similar. So Tajfel doesn't talk about this. This stuff was kind of around earlier, but has had a bit of a resurgence lately, where even if there's no conflict between groups, and this was something that was interesting about the Tajfel studies as well, is there's no competition, there's no conflict, there's no limited resources, let's say, that people were fighting for, that just the formation of these groups or the existence of these groups can create a tendency for this infrahumanization to occur, which basically means human-like categories get reserved for us, for the in-group.
Wow.
And less human-like categories get put on the out-group. So one of the things that's interesting about this is it's not an extreme form of, let's say, dehumanization, where you're thinking of the other people as animals. So that's an interesting distinction. So people they're still seen as people, but it's subtler and it's more commonplace than, let's say, thinking about somebody as animals, which then, let's say, leads to something like genocide and what have you. What we're talking about is just, it's a tendency that just happens. No competition is necessary, but there's these subtle ways where the in-group gets seen as more human than the out-group.
Yeah. That's
so specifically things like intellect and emotion and certain kinds of emotions.
You know, that's really interesting, and it reminds me again. I've been talking to the sociologist, one of my colleagues who's a sociologist, about some of this stuff, and he brought to my attention the work of a sociologist, Professor Abram de Swan, and he talks about civilizing processes and dis-civilizing processes, and those ideas come from another sociologist that's very well known, Norbert Elias, and he talks about this, that during a process of dis-civilizing, or maybe even leading up to that, you get this disidentification, a disidentification process, which is very similar to this kind of dehumanization and vilification of the other group. And I just got to find a paper here, and I have a quote here. So yeah, so this is from de Swan. At the core of Elias's ideas on the civilizing process is an implicit assumption of minimal equality, of some measure of equal treatment and equal esteem. Such a modicum of equality means that people identify with all others in their society as beings that are more or less the same as they themselves are. It implies, moreover, a degree of equality before the law and even some equalization in living standards, right? So that's a civilizing kind of process. Mm-hmm. And it goes on. When one category of people is completely excluded from this minimal equality, the civilizing process may take a different turn and proceed along a different track. And then he talks about that it takes a radical and annihilationist regime to complete the shift in the direction of a dis-civilizing process, end quote. But part of that whole shift, de Swan identifies as disidentification, which is sort of a dehumanization of this group. Mm-hmm. And they talk about how in society this can just occur. A group can be disidentified, and the whole process of dehumanization and vilification can occur, but it's compartmentalized. And so the rest of society just keeps going. They're like, yeah, we're fine. And there's not a big of a problem. And then it also tends to start to get hidden and put out of the public eye. So you don't, you don't see these people. You won't notice them being, in the news so much. You don't notice whenever there are sanctions against them. You don't really find out about it because it just happens now in the margins of society, and the rest of society can continue feeling as if though they're in the civilizing process. I find that very fascinating. That's
fascinating, yeah. And once again, what you see there is a necessary precondition for that to happen. You gotta have the groups.
Yeah, that's right.
You gotta have the classification. It's not possible if you can't classify and divide.
Yeah. If someone was really, really evil and just wanted to really screw up society, what you would just do is create arbitrary categorizations and then just divide people. Mm-hmm. And that naturally would, as you're saying, you're telling me based on Tajfel, is that would set into play this process where people would start discriminating against each other. And that would slowly, if that builds, it would lead to a disintegration of society, and then ultimately end up in this, what Deswan would call a dis-civilizing process.
Yeah. So that's an interesting idea. So there's also the potential that Tajfel talks about of basically a spiral effect. I think he even uses that term. So let's say even the groups get created out of nothing, let's say. But it doesn't necessarily have to stop there. It doesn't necessarily stop there. And so what could happen is, let's say, so you create these groups. Creation of groups then creates this differential treatment, this intergroup behavior, this discrimination. That discrimination can lead to behaviors that then result in additional discrimination, or verifying or validating certain ideas or certain prejudices. So things can kind of sort of build on itself. So it could take on a life of its own, so to speak. So it could start with a trivial division. So let's say this experiment, this is hypothetical. Let's say that experiment continued where you had the overestimators and the underestimators, and then rewards were allocated differently. And let's say those over and underestimators got together separately, and then they met again. Maybe behaviors would be different. Maybe they'd have some kind of disagreement. And then maybe that disagreement would lead to the overestimators saying, yeah, you know what, those underestimators, they're real jerks. Mm. And then maybe that's going to cause, and it could go on like that. So there's a quote from the Scientific American that actually lays this out. So I'll read it now. Yeah. So this is Tajfel, quote: "Once the process is set in motion, they reinforce each other in a relentless spiral in which the weight of predominant causes tends to shift continuously. For example, economic or social competition can lead to discriminatory behavior. That behavior can then, in a number of ways, create attitudes of prejudice. Those attitudes can in turn lead to new forms of discriminatory behavior that create new economic or social disparities. So the vicious circle is continued."
There you go.
So for example, let's say if we're going to bring it back to maybe the pandemic situation, the mandate situation, imagine a scenario where mandate gets implemented. There's a protest. There's a demonstration. And maybe the demonstration causes a bit of a nuisance for people maybe trying to get to work or trying to do their shopping or what have you. And so there's a mandate, there's a demonstration, we don't like the mandate. Now all of a sudden, those people at the demonstration get identified as, look at those annoying people, they're getting in my way. They're probably just like I've heard about them. They're just these blowhards and can never please them, and they're just irritating and annoying. Those people, they muscle in, as Trudeau would say. Those people, they muscle in. They must be racist. They must be misogynists.
That's right.
As well, and you could see the potentiality for the spiral to be created just based on the division. So once you have the classification, you can give the label, you can separate into us and them. Now that creates this reinforcing possibility that otherwise wouldn't have been there. So no one's going around saying, those left-handeds, those lefties, never putting their shopping carts back at the grocery store. That doesn't happen because they're not identifiable as a group. And they're not identified as a group, which means there's not this potential for this spiraling of prejudice and discrimination.
Right. Yeah, so there's a mechanism basically where this thing can just keep going and ultimately get out of control. And so, yeah, I find that very fascinating. There's this idea.
So one of the things I wanted to do was bring it back just to make a note of it. Going back to the infrahumanization, I want to raise it just so people are aware of it, that it happens, and it is subtle. So I want it to be something that people could be aware of in their own thinking, in their own language, and in identifying it in let's say the rhetoric of the media or the rhetoric of other people talking. So it's subtle, but it's, which makes it a little bit more insidious, I think, because it's harder to identify.
Yeah.
There's some more overt forms of it. So the classic example would be the term sheeple. So I think that's almost a perfect exemplar of this infrahumanization, because it's not dehumanization. So
They're still
not calling
people
sheep. Exactly. There's still the people in there.
Right. That's very.
So they're sheep people. Yeah. So they're people, but less.
Yeah.
Less of a person. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And like words like anti-intellectuals, when you refer to a group, they're anti-intellectuals. So they're less intellectually concerned, maybe less intellectual, maybe they have less intellect, you know?
And they're maybe even opposed to intellect.
Yeah, that's right.
Intellect perhaps maybe offends them.
Yeah. And that works both ways. Like, this is the important thing. It's not just the case that, let's say, the minority, that these are the kind of biases that the majority will have against the minority. It's the foundation. It's a foundational outcome of these intergroup dynamics. So the minority can do the same thing to the other people, right? So this is kind of unbiased. These are unbiased processes in some sense. Yeah. It's just that the majority has more power, and they can exert that power then in terms of carrying out their biases.
Yeah, exactly. And that's an interesting, important dynamic as well. Because in the Tajfel, because the groups were flimsy, there was no history, there was no context, there was no opportunity, let's say, for any kind of spiral. There was an equivalence there. There was no real status differential, other than, once again, speaks to the great, paradigm in terms of stripping out anything. So equating the groups basically on every level. There's no differential. Liking this artist or liking that artist, or being an overestimator or underestimator, there's no status differential there. So there's no beating up on the smaller guy. Yeah.
And
but what we have now with applying it to the mandate situation and to the division, the artificial manufactured polarization, we have a clear status differential in the groups.
Yeah.
So there's the stigmatizing, the othering of the unvaccinated.
Yeah.
And let's say the pro-vax or whatever you want to, even the labels. I don't even want to use the labels in the show today to further perpetuate it.
Right.
So one of the things. Okay, we may talk about that later. I don't want to get on too much of an aside. Or I guess I could talk about. So one of the things I've been trying to do personally is watch my language around the labels.
Right.
And there's lots of opportunities for these different labels, right? The us and the them. What I've been trying to do is substitute the label for people who have been double or whatever, and people who have not been, or people who have been and are against, and so on and so on. So always leading with the people who have done something or have something. It's not a equivalence of, you are that thing that is the group label. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because you're using people. So you're using a more general category where everybody's united.
Exactly. Everybody's people.
Yeah.
Everybody's an individual. Leading with that. And then there's characteristics that follow.
Yeah. That's
in taking away that that higher order classification.
We'll get to solutions.
But anyways,
we'll get to solutions in a minute.
I want to get that out there because it just came across. But yeah, we could talk about the status differential. Do you want to talk about the status?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah. So basically the idea is that you have in this categorization case that we have right now, people with who have been vaccinated or who believe in.
It's awkward. It's harder. It's harder.
Who believe in coercive
Doesn't mean it's not worth it. It's just harder.
Yeah. But do you notice what I'm doing too in my language, right? I got to call myself out. I say, people who believe in coercive vaccination, right? Like I'm already coercive is kind of a negative idea, right? It suggests that you're violating bioethics, right? So it's really interesting. And the question is, do you battle discrimination of the minority by then also vilifying the majority. And presumably vilifying each other is not going to end up in a, in a great
probably
place.
Not going to.
So I should slap myself.
Well, but that's an interesting perspective. So I think with the status differential, what you're seeing is, so you're seeing the hammering, and you saw it in the Trudeau clip at the beginning. You're seeing the hammering of the them, in this case, the them being we use Trudeau's label, anti-vaxxers, I believe you call them.
Yep.
Right.
Those
and then he comes in later. Yeah, he comes in later with by the way, they're also this other bad thing, and this other bad thing, and this other bad thing, which means there are probably other bad things that he didn't even talk about. They're just, bad.
Yep.
These bad people.
Yeah.
So you're seeing that strategy get used sort of at the institutional level. So this is the Prime Minister saying this, right? I don't think that can be understated.
Right.
This isn't coming from a couple guys, just two guys talking on a podcast. This is coming from Prime Minister.
And so he's if you think, I'm going to just jump back to Milgram for a second because he's in my head. He's the authority. He would be considered the primary authority figure here.
Yeah. Yeah. But he's also the authority figure in this case is also referring to science.
True.
So maybe he's executant even. You could potentially. So maybe there's opportunity to see but yeah, definitely representing the authority, right? So the experimenter probably.
Yeah.
At the very least. Yeah.
That's right. So in some sense, he's at least articulating the categorization principle, right?
Yeah.
It's who is in the us group and who is in the them group, and what are their characteristics and what are our characteristics, right? We've all been cooperative and working together for getting out of this, for the greater good, and then there's them, and their decisions, they're going to hurt all of us. And all of us, all Canadians, and our children especially, right? And so on. So so there's this clear difference in terms of, I think the word vilification essentially applies to some extent, right? That you vilify the other, demonize them in some way.
So there's already a status differential because it's coming from an institutional authority, right?
Right.
And then on top of that, you get the overt beatdown of these labels, right? So it's not just saying, I don't agree with them, measured language, we need to work together. But that's not nice. I don't like that. We don't like that. The Liberal Party doesn't go along with those ideas. It's a very direct, attack, right, on the character of these individuals, what they stand for, the risks they pose. So one of the things that does is that's going to create a further status differential. So not only is there an initial institutional differential between, let's say, the government and just everyday people who have different values, it's the government saying these other people are even lower status. No one wants to be, a misogynist or racist. You're getting less than, all the way through that. So what that does then is, let's say anybody who happens to fall in the categorization, anybody who happens to be in the them, right? Now you have this, let's say, baggage, this additional status loss that what that's going to do. So one of the things people like to do is they like to feel good about themselves, right? And one of the ways people like to feel good about themselves is who their group affiliations are.
Right.
So do you want to be affiliated with, associated with the misogynists, the racists, the people who are going to be hurting everybody, putting everybody at risk? Nobody's going to want to be like, that's
who I am.
That's my t-shirt. Yeah, that's my group. Right? There's not a lot of incentive. There's not a lot of status there. You don't get anything out of that. There's not a lot of, unemployed pride.
Yeah.
Like, I'm really proud to be on, because there's not a lot of status that comes with that. So what that's going to do then is it's going to motivate people to not affiliate with that group. And when there's two groups available, that's going to incentivize joining the other group.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And how do you do that?
Well, you're gonna get vaccinated, right?
Yeah. So in addition to all the other pressures, right? How difficult life is, and now you're getting the psychological, let's say, attack to incentivize, to push you to make it more that much more appealing to sign up with the other team.
Yeah.
Another thing it could also do is make it more likely you're going to go underground and maybe stay underground. So you're not going to be public with your group status.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to be very excited. You're not going to be all that excited to share it.
Yep.
Or be proud of it, which means other people looking around, they're not going to see a lot of non-racist, non-misogynists in that category.
Yeah.
Which is going to further perpetuate them to go even further underground, or let's say stay in the closet.
Yeah.
So it's going to be this reinforcing tendency to, one, try and join the other group maybe, or if you do want to stay in this group, you're going to be real quiet about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just sort of linking this back to the Milgram concepts, what we saw there was that the executant, when they would start punishing the victim, they would devalue the victim as well. So you have the rhetoric of categorization, and then you have the devaluing of the other, right, coming from the authority structure, from the institutions. But then as people actually implement these things and keep their family away from the Christmas dinner and off the bus and away from work, you have a further devaluing of the individual, right? So you could see how these things just kind of start to snowball because there's multiple mechanisms at play. And then the executant, as we like to say, it doesn't want to be associated with what's happening to the victim. And so they end up associating more closely with the authority, right? They feel like they want to be more coupled. So they're more likely to obey the authority structure now because it becomes like a moral transgression also to try to do something different, to disobey or to not comply. And so you see all these mechanisms now together at play, which create this snowball effect that lead to the next mechanism, and next thing you know, you've got this massive division in our society. That's quite shocking.
Yeah, but it's got to start with that differential.
Yes.
So maybe this is a good time to talk about Milgram a little bit. So just to tie in, because you touched on it.
Yeah.
To tie in some of these processes. So here's another hypothesis. You could disagree with this.
Yep.
But here's what I think. I think Milgram inadvertently smuggled in some of these in-group, out-group processes into his experiment.
Oh, sneaky Milgram.
So this isn't I don't think it was intentional, because remember, this stuff came 10 years later at least, right? What's the...
Yeah, 60 to 63. And the
book came out.
And then Tajfel 70 something. Yeah. But he had already written about these things before that.
Exactly. So not this isn't any kind
of
indictment of them. It's just to show how interrelated some of these are. And I think one of the things that was particularly important to highlight and really jumped out at me with this in-group, out-group stuff is it's so foundational. It's so fundamental. And it seems so, I think when you point it out, it can kind of seem obvious, but it's necessary for some of these processes. And because it's necessary, I think it's easy to ignore it and not pay attention to it. So I think just the identification, like I said, identifying, highlighting that just this simple categorization. So once you categorize, the train's already left the station.
Mm-hmm. And so in Milgram then?
So in Milgram, remember what he did? He brought people in, said, you're a teacher, you're a learner, you're in this group, you're in this other group.
Yep.
So automatically, he's already classifying. And it's hard to imagine doing that study without classifying. But let's say he didn't necessarily need to use the labels, use the roles. But I think those roles, those labels, I think you could potentially interpret the Milgram studies, the findings, as additional support for the in-group, out-group dynamics. So it's consistent, at least.
Yeah. And in this case,
doesn't contradict.
Yeah. And in this case, the categories of teacher and learner already come with some pre-existing baggage as well, right? Because
it's not the dots. It's not the dots. It's not the artists. There is, exactly.
The teacher typically has, higher status than a learner, right? There's kind of like a subordination of a learner to a teacher, that kind of an idea already at play. So definitely, and in this case, the teacher, because they're carrying out the experimenter's wishes, they might be placed in the same category as the experimenters. They're trying to nudge their way close to the category of the authority, right? Into that science category and so on. I definitely
they're
see
affiliated. That category, that group is affiliated with science.
Jeff, I think this is a crazy cool insight.
Yeah, I think it's, like I said, I don't think it takes, I'm not saying it takes away from any of the other mechanisms, but I just, it's there. I think it's a fascinating, and it was part of it's just being able to, just thinking about the in-group, out-group while we've been having conversations about Milgram. I think once you start identifying some of these processes, and this is one of the things we want to do, is make people become aware, identify the frameworks, have some vocabulary, to talk about them. Because I think once you then bring some of these ideas, to the top of your head, it's much easier to identify.
So let me take this a little bit further then, take your idea a little bit further and ask this question. Do you think that physical proximity could actually serve as a categorization principle? Because you remember the whole Milgram obedience stuff really depended upon physical proximity of the teacher to the learner, and of course, also from the teacher to the authority, that proximity as well. So it seems like actual physical proximity to other people may maybe highlight certain categorizations of us versus them. So if we're in the same room together, that would be such an interesting experiment. We should just put people in the same room together, not even categorize them on any other category, just same room versus different room. And then see if you get these dynamics playing out. That's the prediction.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The physical separation, you could think of that even as a manifestation of the classification, the categorization, the psychological categorization, where you're simplifying. One of the ways you simplify is divide, collect, aggregate. And the physical separation would be a direct manifestation of that. Yeah. Where I'm in this group with these people, and they're over there.
Yeah. And okay, so another quick thought related to this, because now you got all my ideas flowing here. Thinking about Milgram as an in-group, out-group, intergroup dynamic kind of thing. And I'm just looking here because they had this experiment where they had two authorities, and one of them goes into the victim's role. So the authority goes into the victim's chair. Okay. And
is it after the study was underway?
No. Like the other participant doesn't show up. I'm just really working off the top of my head here. So,
okay. All right. This is a real study. This is
a real study. This is experiment 16. Okay. Two authorities, one as a victim. This variation is similar in general design to the one described above, in that subjects confronts two experimenters alike in appearance and apparent authority. However, at the outset, while the two experimenters and the subject are waiting for the fourth participant to appear, a phone call is received in the laboratory. The fourth participant, it appears, has canceled his appointment. The experimenters express disappointment, indicating that they have a particular need to complete the accumulation of data that night. One suggested an experimenter might serve as a subject, that though a poor substitute, he would at least enable them to meet their experimental quota. The experimenters flip a coin to determine which one will serve in this way. The loser then draws with the subject to determine who will be teacher and who learner. Of course, that draw is rigged, blah, blah, blah. And then they start. And he says, one has been defined in the victim's role, and the other has been defined by the flip of a coin in the superordinate status. And there's a table 4 with some results, but he says, what occurs is quite striking. The experimenter strapped into the electric chair fares no better than a victim who is not an authority at all. So it's kind of mind blowing, because once you've taken, oh, this is brilliant. You've taken the authority, another authority, and you've recategorized them on the basis of a flip of a coin. They're now in the victim category. And how do you treat them? Well, you treat them no different than any other schmo who ends up in that chair.
It doesn't matter what they had categorization they had before.
Yes, that's right.
They lose that. Superseded.
Dude, that
you used to be an expert. Not anymore.
Right. Yeah. So I like the way you said that, because that reminds me then of the way that some of these experts are being treated, right? Who dissent.
Once you get put in that them category, let's say, I'll bring the us and them back to Milgram. Once you get put in that other category, there's no, you get the same treatment.
That's right.
Maybe even worse, because there is some in-group, out-group stuff that says members who give the group a bad name get treated worse than out-group members. So, which is interesting stuff.
Right. So they get treated even worse. So what you're
potentially even worse. So if you're in the group, you may be even an exemplar member of that group, and you start giving that group a bad name, you're going to get maybe worse treatment than outgroup. You might have been better off just being in the outgroup the whole time.
So if you're a vaccinologist and you can be at the top of your game and you realize, I kind of disagree. The data don't really support all these things that the politicians are saying. I'm going to speak up. Well, you're now in the other group.
You get the label. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you're all that gray, all those nuances, differentials, manufactured polarization. Now you are automatically way over there. No differential.
Yeah. And then you get shocked.
You're just like them. You're just like them.
And so, and now I'm thinking of another way to think about this, because one of the principles you pointed out in the in-group, out-group stuff is that you tend to punish, in some sense, those in the out-group, right? One of the points that you made is that you tend to punish those in the out-group and not those in the in-group. And it makes me think again of the participant, right, in this case, because the participant has this conflict, right? What do I do? Do I hurt the participant, or do I get out of the experiment? Getting out of or stopping the experiment is kind of like punishing the authority, the experimenter, right?
Yep.
And so in that case, because they feel grouped with the experimenter, with the authority, they're less likely to choose to punish that authority, the experimenter, than the victim. And so they just keep punishing the victim in that case. So again, that could be understood from this in-group, out-group dynamic. Man, now I see it all as in-group, out-group.
It's all in-group. Yeah. Welcome to the group. Welcome to the in-group, out-group perceiving group.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Now,
be part of the group that sees everything as in-group, out-group.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's interesting too is something you brought up last time was the superhuman, or what was the word? I can't remember. I think it was superhuman. So the authority comes with these extra, let's say, perceiving abilities, or like these superhuman characteristics. So it's not individuals. They have knowledge and awareness
beyond any human being, beyond the intentions and wills and whims of a human being. He called it counter anthropomorphism. Right.
There you go. And I think that's interesting to think about. So we're going to bring in the in-group, out-group again to the Milgram in the context of the infrahumanization. So in Milgram, so let's say if groups are created, presumably there's going to be, so we already talked about dehumanization of the victim. So let's say infrahumanization is going to be happening. The victim is going to be seen as less human, at the very least, less human, right? Not fully not human, but to say less human. And then if the in-group becomes the authority, so now the out-group becomes less human, and the in-group alongside the authority isn't just more human, is actually potentially extra human.
Yep.
So you're getting an extra boost. You're getting extra status by staying in proximity in the same group as the authority.
And by extra human, maybe shedding the limitations of humanity and becoming like something more even. almost like
so
transhuman.
in-group, out-group, you get for that. So yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, you know, the one thing that I find, do you have any other thoughts on Milgram, or can we move on to?
Yeah, go ahead, move on.
Yeah. So I just wanted to actually just reiterate how foundational really in terms of what's going on psychologically these in-group dynamics are, because I took a quick look into the neurocognitive literature, and what you find there is that these intergroup biases, even in the paradigm used by Tajfel, are related to very specific neurobiological processes, okay? And there's a great paper I recommend people read. It was published in Perspectives on Psychological Science, which is, you know, a very well-known and esteemed journal in our field. It's by Cikara. I think I spelled that name, or I pronounced that correctly. Cikara, and Bavel, Bavel, 2014, is called The Neuroscience of Intergroup Relations and Integrative Review. And they point to a number of different papers and different neural mechanisms that are at play. And in one case, they referred to a study using magnetic resonance imaging, and this was done by Volz and colleagues in 2009. And what they find is that when you're in this process and engage in these in-group, out-group distinctions, the medial prefrontal cortex, so it's in the frontal area, kind of in the middle, it becomes active. And that area is also involved in processing the self. So it's in terms of like the individual self, but also the social self, how you relate to your social group. So there's all this self-referential kind of processing going on there. And I have a quote here. Let me see if I can find it, pull it up on my screen here. Quote, "In the present study, we used a modified version of the minimal group paradigm by Tajfel and colleagues, originally designed to investigate the effects of social categorization on behavior while participants' neurovascular activity was measured. As expected, the present imaging results revealed an activation within a network centered on the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, DMPFC, specifically for social identity processes." So there you go.
So that means what, Dan, for the group, for the categorization?
Yeah. So what that means, I think, is that sometimes we tend to think about these processes somehow like, you know, psychological, in that they're somehow soft or not really grounded in some concrete brain biological activity. But what it suggests is that just this sort of creating these flimsy minimal groups leads to different brain processing of, you know, when you're choosing between your own group and the other group. So this is actually like really going on. I mean, it's obviously it's got to happen in the brain if it's going to happen, right? At least, you know, if you take the idea that your behavior is driven at least in part by brain processes. And so maybe it's not that surprising, but I just want to remind people that this is the case. And also, if you use various sorts of hormones, like for instance, you can increase the favoritism towards your own group, towards the in-group, by administering people oxytocin, which is just generally known as the love hormone. And so you can do that without actually leading them to devalue or punish the out-group more. So there's this like intergroup love that happens, you know, not intergroup love, in-group love that happens to your own.
Right. Yes, thank you.
To be clear on these words, in-group love that happens, and it's related to this hormone, and you can change it based on just injecting people or administering people this particular hormone in some way. So this, to me, these processes are fundamental, and I could definitely see them at play in the current situation.
And in that MRI study, they were using the Tajfel paradigm.
Precisely. Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So this is you mentioned the flimsy. It's the flimsy categorization. And you're seeing the brain activation.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So it's not like this social, there's none of the social, let's say any of the characteristics of groups that you typically associate with groups with respect to, okay, you're
Right.
part of the group for a reason. There's a history. There's norms. It's none of that. This is all just fundamental, basic categorization of, okay, the experimenter just told you you're an overestimator, so now you're in that group.
Yeah.
Never thought of it. Never cared of it before in your entire life.
Yeah. And, you know, and it's
And now your brain is saying,
bam.
okay.
Yeah. This is in-group, out-group. And it reminds me actually of something that Tajfel has here. He talks about that we develop and are exposed to what he calls a generic norm of behavior towards outgroups, right? So somehow and he talks about it in terms of learning, maybe at times you've just been steeped in in-group, out-group dynamics from the time you were knee-high to a grasshopper. And this leads to this norm. And it seems like that probably is really linked to some, you know, neural networks that get triggered. As soon as you get the most flimsiest basic categorization, bam, these things pop into play and they're active.
So should we talk about solutions?
Let's go to some solutions.
Okay. How do we fix this?
Well, you know, there's a paper that I found to be really, really helpful. It's titled War and Peace, Possible Approaches to Reducing Intergroup Conflict by Cohen and Insko. And they're from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And basically the paper suggests 4 different ways that you might be able to reduce intergroup conflict. And maybe we can just mention these very quickly. What do you think?
Sure.
Okay. So the first one that they have here is, the first suggestion is to promote contemplation of future consequences of people's actions. Okay. So you got to make them think that there's going to be a future here and you're going to have to interact with these people sometime in the future. And so in the context of the vaccine mandates, maybe those in the coercive vax group can consider the fact that they're going to have to live with the people who they're coercing later on. And maybe secondly, that once you allow this kind of discrimination and oppression to take hold in your society, that it's possible that the circumstances can change and you become the receiving end of some of these discrimination processes, right? So there's multiple reasons why, if you think about the future, if you're a coercive vaxxer, this could lead to some negative ends, right? And you got to live with people afterwards. They're still going to be out there. They're going to be your relatives, right? The people that you didn't allow to come to your Christmas dinner or your Thanksgiving dinner or whatever, they're still your relatives, right? You're going to be living with them in the future. So that's one possible thought. Okay, number 2. One of the things they suggest is that group members, and especially the leaders of the groups, should be encouraged to behave like individuals in line with their own values and morals that are independent of the group. And they particularly talk about this in the context of leaders, but I think it applies also to other group members as well. And the basic idea is that individuals are less likely to act negatively towards other people than they might act as a member of a group towards members of another group, right? So you've got to try to degroup them, essentially isolate and individuate them. And people should be encouraged to think of themselves not as a member of these groups, but as an individual. And so in the context of the vaccine mandates, then, you want to remind people of their pre-pandemic values, their personal pre-pandemic values. And I think a lot of people would say, I'm against discrimination. I'm against oppression. I'm for equality. And so now, even though I'm a part of this group, I'm going to put those things aside and act more along the lines of my pre-pandemic values. And
one of the things that I'll just jump in. One of the things that the literature shows is you'll get less discrimination across groups if there's a norm in the group to not discriminate.
So we got to spread the norm.
If it's part of the group's norm that we don't discriminate, then you're going to see less discriminatory behavior across groups.
Yeah.
Compared to if there's no norm at all, or if there's actually a norm for pro-discrimination.
Yeah. And, you know, along similar lines of individuating, I think we can bring back the whole Milgram dynamic as well and suggest that people should be encouraged to take on personal responsibility for the actions that are unfolding. So if you support an oppressive action, if you're the one carrying out that action, you have to take personal responsibility. You're no longer, don't think of yourself as part of a group somehow that you're protected from, your own responsibility. Get people to own their agency. Okay, so
that's a great insight. You could really see the through line there.
Yeah.
That the individualizing.
Yeah, individualizing
is so, it would be so effective.
Yeah.
Because it would work on those processes. It works on the in-group, out-group.
Yeah, and we should...
People,
that's right. And we should think about the other group also not as members of a group, but as individuals. And what the literature, I think, if I remember correctly, shows is that when leaders actually, they hold on to their own values, they can actually lead to less extreme decisions, right? Because a group might try to polarize them in some way.
Right.
And it can be less extreme. Okay, number 3, promote empathy towards those in the other group. So apparently there's quite a lot of literature that's showing that, you can really reduce some of these negative dynamics, intergroup dynamics, if you just promote empathy. And the idea here is to, have people, let's say in the coercive vaccine group, put themselves in the shoes of those who are being oppressed, those unvaccinated or people who are non-disclosing who are being oppressed. What does it feel like to be forced to take a treatment that these people, consider to be a genetic treatment against your will? What does that actually feel like? And
that seems like a hard thing to do, right? To get people to empathize.
Yeah.
So one way of maybe thinking about that is, I don't know if this would work, but let's say somebody's really, really pro, like as pro-vaccine as you can get.
Yeah.
Imagine that person thinking, what if it was, I'll say, what if it was, let's say against the law, so to speak, or there's mandates preventing people from getting vaccinated.
Right.
What if your employer found out you were vaccinated, that you'd be put on unpaid leave?
Exactly.
What would that feel like? So is this something you really want to do? Is this something you really think is right, but you're going to be maybe punished or ostracized? Or if you are vaccinated, you can't go to a gym, a restaurant, can't get on a plane if you are vaccinated.
Yeah.
How would that feel?
How would that feel? Yeah. Think these things through. And I think we could also then say, for those who are unvaccinated, in the unvaccinated group, think about how it feels to some of these people to be gripped so strongly by the fear of dying from COVID that they would do this, right? Like, it helps. Everybody's got to understand the other people, right? In order for this to really start to dissolve. And I think that if we start to see what the other people are feeling and experiencing, and show some empathy, maybe that'll lead to some dialogue, and maybe that's going to lead to less discrimination and oppression.
Right. It's going to start with the individuals themselves not thinking in terms of the classification and categorization.
Yes, exactly.
I think that's the first step, right? Which then frees up and then creates because once you have the division and categorization, let's say we know from Tajfel, you looked at these dots, you're over, you're under.
You're screwed.
Got to get past that. And that's going to start in people's minds.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so the final one, point 4 here that they raise in that paper, War and Peace, they say ensure that all the people work towards a common goal, that they recognize that there is a common goal. And I think this one is really hard, because the question is, what exactly is that common goal? And so maybe we can articulate it this way for people. I think what we all want in people put in these different groups is a healthy, functioning, and vibrant society in the future. That's what we all want. And I think that might be a great common goal to hold to. And so now we're given this message. We're told that the way to reach that goal is just to vaccinate as many people as possible, even if that means going against some people's will, oppressing them a little bit, putting them to the margins of society, those people who disagree with that kind of a solution. And, we put 2 needles into every arm, and maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe it'll take more, who knows, right? But that's what we got to do. Mm-hmm. But, and I think here's the key thing, we have to realize that oppressing the minority to try to reach that goal is counterproductive, because oppressing individuals is antithetical to having a healthy, functional, and vibrant society. It's antithetical to that. So that's not the solution. We have to figure out a different way to solve this and to deal with the many other kinds of structural problems that might be present in our society. We need to roll up our sleeves, Jeff, but not to get another booster shot, to start working on solutions that don't unduly punish people, chunking them into these groups, categorizing them, and then oppressing them and putting to the margins of society. That's where we need to be.
Yeah, and the way there isn't to be more strict and more severe in order to eliminate this, let's say, this segment of the population. Yeah. That's even more antithetical. Right. So it's completely definite. I love that point. It's completely definitionally inconsistent to have this group of individuals being discriminated, being punished in that kind of society. So you already lost.
Exactly.
You're already off. You already failed the mission.
And history,
and to get to that,
go ahead.
And to get to that, you're not going to solve that by getting a needle in every arm in any way possible. That's going to make it worse.
Exactly. That's right.
It's like saying, I'm going to go and, let's say, for example, I'm going to be low carb or not eat carbs. But then every meal you have pasta or bread.
Yeah.
You have this thing that's completely inconsistent with what you're saying you're trying to do.
It's counterproductive.
You don't get there by having more carbs.
And history shows us shows this to be true, right? Anytime society has tried to advance itself by oppressing a subset of the people, ultimately it bites them in the ass, and it reveals actually that society wasn't achieving its goal, right?
Right.
So this is really important. Do you have any other thoughts on potential solutions, Jeff?
Yeah. So I talked about one earlier, and this is one I think it's something, what I like about it, it's hard, but it's the small one this everybody can do starting today. So it's something everybody can do now, is watch the language. Watch your language.
Yeah.
Watch what you're saying with respect to the categories and classifications. Try and like, as a way of starting to think of it as people, use labels, or if you're going to use labels or categories, maybe use labels or categories that start with people who are, people who have, people who think, versus these other labels, these other pejoratives. I think that's one thing that, like I said, it's relatively easy to do if you watch yourself. It's small, but like I said, it's small, so anybody can start it. Anybody can do it at any moment. It's something I've been trying to do.
I feel admonished.
Maybe to varying degrees of success, but
I feel admonished from you saying that, and I think it's good.
This is about. I was meaning you. Then you picked up on it, Dan. I was.
Yeah,
I was coming at you, Dan. Yeah.
No. Well, because I like. Look, the key is that what's the point of knowing this stuff if we don't apply it, right? Even to ourselves.
That's one of the things, right? It makes it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's going to take some retraining for me to actually. To do all that. Okay, but go on.
Reprogramming. So the other thing is, I think like a main, and how to do this, that's another question, but let's say a broader strategy is elimination of the categorization, elimination of the groups. I think that's central. I think you raised some interesting ideas of maybe ways to eventually do that. So maybe you have to, break a few eggs before you get there, in terms of like how that happens to break down this division. So I think breaking down the division, I think that's the idea, breaking down the classification, categorization. And I think one way to do that you touched on is having some kind of higher order goal or value that everybody's working towards, or that everybody can agree on. Is there something we can all agree on? And then from there, let's proceed. And I think one thing related to that would be the idea of the integrity of the person, the bodily autonomy. So if everybody can agree on that's a really, really, really important value that we don't want to take lightly and we don't want to play around with. Because if we start playing around with that, that's going to lead to some dark places probably pretty quick.
Yes. So
if we can all agree on that, I think that's maybe a place to start.
I like it.
And then from there you say, okay, rebuttal to that could be, maybe we could do some vaccine, apologetics here. Rebuttal to that and Trudeau even said this, well, you don't have the right to make me sick, right? You don't have the right to make my kids sick, or your kids don't have the right to make my kids sick. You say, okay, let's say you take that at face value, say, okay, maybe fair point, sure. So then let's not propose a solution that's going to violate somebody else's bodily autonomy in order for you to preserve yours.
That's right.
So if we can all agree that, yeah, bodily autonomy, sure. Perhaps, let's say, there could be a different discussion, but let's say concede that point. Sure, I don't have the right to make you sick, just like you don't have the right to force me to take something. They both involve bodily autonomy, right? Yeah. So if we can agree on that, now we say, okay, now let's talk about other ways we can maybe achieve those goals together that doesn't involve the violation of bodily autonomy.
Yeah, which it's also very interesting in the rhetoric, right? You don't have the right to make me sick, but it's not you making me sick; it's the virus that's making me sick. It's a virus that's occurring in the environment. You didn't cause the virus; I didn't cause the virus. Yeah, right. But somebody's putting 2 needles in your arms, right? And there's an asymmetry there that people have to understand. And so okay,
it's a great point. So I would say, even if you concede that point, I still think you can say, okay, as many issues as there are with that perspective, even if you concede that to them, which I think was a pretty big concession, I think you could still come to,
that's right.
Okay, so then now what?
Yeah.
So if you can concede that, definitionally you should be able to concede that the mandates are violating the same principle that you want to preserve.
Yeah, that's right.
So now we agree. So now let's move on to some other solution.
Let's come up with another solution. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have another couple solutions very quickly here that also emerge out of the Milgram stuff. And one of the things that we never covered last time was that Milgram suggested that, or he observed that the person that's the teacher, so the participant, doesn't often ask critical questions.
Oh.
Okay. And so let me just read from his book here. So this is where he's talking about counter-anthropomorphism. And so let me see. The human element behind agencies and institutions is denied. I'm quoting. Thus, when the experimenter says the experiment requires that you continue, the subject feels this to be an imperative that goes beyond any merely human command. He does not ask the seemingly obvious question, whose experiment? Why should the designer be served while the victim suffers? And then he goes on, people have to read it. It's such a fantastic book. But he's saying, look, people when they're in this situation, they don't ask questions. And I think that what we have to do is encourage people to start asking more questions, right? Like, number one, is this division into these groups functional? Right? Like, and what are the consequences of this kind of a division? And that's what we're trying to address here, right? So that would be one question. But also think about some of these authorities, like, who are these people in Canada on the science table making these decisions? Right. What scientific data are they using to make these decisions? You know, what is the scientific evidence that justifies a vaccine mandate, for example? You know, if the vaccines can't stop infection and spread, why force other people to take them for the greater good, right? People have to start asking all sorts of questions. What is the actual data? How was it collected? What are the biases in the data? And hopefully we'll talk about issues surrounding data collection and interpretation and so on in some other episodes of this show. But people have to just start asking more questions. And the one that's most pertinent to this episode is this categorization that we find ourselves being imposed upon us, is that going to lead to something good or not?
Yeah. But I think what you see, to answer your question a little bit, I know it's a bit of a rhetorical question, but they're asking questions. There's a general sense that you shouldn't be asking questions. That if you start asking questions, you ask too many questions, you're going to probably be risk putting in that other group.
Yes.
You might be one of them.
Yeah. Moral transgression to ask questions.
Transgress. Yeah.
Right.
Just the act. Yeah. Yeah.
But you have to basically engage in that because, and this is a second point I just want to make as I think about the Milgram stuff since our last episode, what Milgram found was that when they were in this conflict, right, they're inflicting pain, but they don't want to disobey the authority, and they start to fidget, they tremble, they get anxious, they're kind of awkward and so on, because all this tension is building up.
Tension, yeah.
Right? And what he found is that as soon as they decided to actually not comply anymore, all of that tension was released and they experienced a certain degree of psychological peace, an inner peace. And at that point, they're like, no, I'm just not going on anymore. And, he talks about this. It's on page 185 in the book. Let's see if I can just very quickly get to it. But yeah, he talks about the emotional signs when people are in conflict like this. The emotional signs observed in the laboratory, trembling, anxious laughter, acute embarrassment, are evidence of an assault on, he's talking about these basic rules of people behaving in civilized society. And then he says, the remarkable thing is, once the ice is broken through disobedience, virtually all the tension, anxiety, and fear evaporate. It's gone. Okay. So psychological peace is experienced. And I think, we have to realize that as soon as we break this imposed categorization into us and them, and then being forced into behaving negatively towards them, when we break that, when we step outside of that, when we consider people as individuals, when we stop discriminating, that's actually going to bring more deeper and lasting psychological peace. And I think that would be very, very powerful. And it almost then frees us up to be able to come up with other solutions.
Yep.
And so what I think we need to do is have people in society who are maybe gonna be or trying to be pushed in the roles of executants and so on to stop and then come out of the closet, so to speak. And other people who are against this categorization, against these mandates, to just come forward and even just stepping out and, facing what might initially feel like a moral transgression against the authority. Yeah. Once that happens, I think people will experience an inner peace and then will be able to cooperate better and think more clearly and arrive at functional solutions to the present problem.
Yeah, that's a great point. Imagine the teacher in that state that you described, the tension, the nervousness, the discomfort. Imagine that individual trying to be a critical thinker.
Yeah.
And to weigh complex problems, look at data, try and be rational. Imagine that happening. It's probably not going to happen.
It's because all that anxiety creates cognitive load, which is taking cognitive resources away from trying to solve the problem.
And then the picture you paint of the person coming to this psychological peace. Now imagine, okay, clear heads, level heads, critical thinking, evaluation, creative problem solving. under, like you said, under those conditions, then we might see some differential solutions emerge and maybe some progress.
Right.
Whereas otherwise it would not have been possible given the pre-existing psychological state. It just doesn't make it possible.
Right.
But how do you get, you got to get them to take that first leap. There has to be the transgression first.
Yeah.
So the thing that's causing the discomfort is exactly the thing that needs to be confronted to get over it.
Challenged, yes. Mm-hmm.
Challenge, yeah.
Yeah. And then you get the resulting piece from that after that. Yes. Yeah. I mean, these dynamics are so fascinating and so important for us to understand, because I think they're going to help us move forward here. Now, we should just, finish off here and say that, again, these are not exhaustive dynamics at play in this pandemic situation in the context of these vaccine mandates. We can think of others as well. And maybe we'll address some of those other ones in the next episodes.
Yeah. Yeah. We may not even get off these mandates. There's so much here.
Well, hopefully they'll just end before we, and then we just gotta.
There's that.
Can move on to other things.
Then it'll be like it'll be a retrospective.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, for now, Jeff, I want to thank you, man, for bringing this stuff into my consciousness, because it's fascinating stuff, and I will talk to you later.
Okay. Talk to you later, Dan.